In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where winding roads curved around quaint houses and children's laughter echoed through the parks, there lived a calico cat named Whiskers. Whiskers wasn't just any cat. Her fur was a mosaic of orange, black, and white, and her emerald-green eyes glimmered with intelligence. She had been a part of the Mason family for 8 years, ever since Emma Mason found her shivering under a car during a torrential storm. Emma, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked auburn hair and kind, weary eyes, had raised Whiskers as if she were her own child. Emma lived alone after her husband, Tom, passed away unexpectedly years ago. Whiskers became her constant companion, filling the empty spaces in her life with soft purrs and warm, comforting cuddles. Their bond was deeper than words could express. It was an unspoken understanding, a mutual reassurance that neither was alone. Their days were spent in serene rituals. Morning coffee on the sun-dappled porch, Whiskers perched on the railing watching the sparrows. Evenings by the fireplace, where Emma would read aloud from her favorite novels while Whiskers curled on her lap. This harmony, however, was about to be shaken in a way no one could predict. One day, a new presence arrived on their street, a sleek, black sedan parked just across from Emma's house. It belonged to a man named Paul Renner, a mysterious figure with sharp features and eyes that darted like a hawk's. He rented the old house across the street, a property that had been vacant for months. Paul kept to himself, rarely engaging with the neighbors, always looking preoccupied, which fueled speculation and murmurs among the local residents. Emma noticed him from her window but paid little attention. Her life was already full with Whiskers and the cherished memories she held onto tightly. What Emma didn't know was that Paul's arrival would intersect her peaceful life in an unimaginable way. The summer afternoon sun glowed warmly over the neighborhood as Emma prepared for her weekly visit to the local farmer's market. She picked up her worn wicker basket and glanced at Whiskers, who lounged lazily on the kitchen counter, eyes half closed. "I'll be back soon, girl," she said, planting a gentle kiss on Whiskers' head. The cat's ears flicked as if in response, a soft purr rumbling in her throat. Emma stepped out and closed the door behind her. Whiskers watched from the window, her gaze following Emma as she walked down the garden path. Then, something in the street caught Whiskers' eye, the glint of sunlight bouncing off the hood of Paul's black sedan as it rolled slowly down the road. There was a sense of unease in the air, like the silence before a storm. Paul was behind the wheel, and his face was set in a mask of frustration. He checked his phone and swerved slightly as he accelerated. Meanwhile, Emma, blissfully unaware, walked on the opposite side of the street, the hum of her thoughts drowned out by the chirping of cicadas. Whiskers' fur bristled, and she let out a sharp meow, the urgency of which would have startled anyone nearby. But Emma was too far to hear it. Paul's car picked up speed, moving erratically as he tried to multitask behind the wheel. Whiskers' eyes widened, pupils dilated with alarm as the car drifted toward the sidewalk where Emma strolled. The world seemed to slow as Whiskers sprang into action. She darted down from the window ledge, pushed through the small, partially open kitchen window with feline agility, and landed on the lawn below. The grass crunched under her paws as she raced toward Emma, propelled by a force beyond instinct, a deep, visceral need to protect the person who had saved her so many years ago. Emma reached the crosswalk, oblivious to the car veering dangerously close. Paul's attention snapped back to the road just as Whiskers leapt into view, a streak of orange, black, and white cutting through the air. Whiskers landed squarely on the asphalt, right in Paul's line of sight. Her sudden appearance startled him, his hands jerking the steering wheel as he instinctively slammed on the brakes. The shriek of tires pierced the quiet street, and the car skidded to a halt mere inches from the curb, narrowly missing Emma, who stood frozen with shock. Emma's eyes met Whiskers as the cat let out a distressed yowl. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the scent of lilacs from Emma's garden, and the only sound was Emma's own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The reality of how close she had come to being hit by the car settled over her like a suffocating blanket. Paul stepped out of his car, his face pale, hands trembling as he looked from Emma to Whiskers, who now stood panting on the asphalt. "I'm so sorry. "I wasn't paying attention," he said, voice tight with panic. Emma, still reeling, took a deep breath and nodded, unable to form words. She dropped to her knees and reached for Whiskers, who immediately pressed her small warm body into Emma's chest, purring as if to reassure her that it was all over now. But the incident was only the beginning. The days that followed brought unexpected changes. Word of the near accident spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors expressed relief that Emma was safe, while others cast wary glances at Paul's house, their curiosity and suspicion deepening. Emma herself couldn't shake the image of Whiskers leaping into the path of danger, acting with a fearlessness that animals weren't supposed to have. The memory clung to her, a constant reminder of just how fragile life could be. Despite his initial apology, Paul became more reclusive. Emma would occasionally spot him through her curtains, pacing his living room with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. He rarely left his house, and when he did, he moved quickly, head down, as if trying to avoid unwanted attention. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of deep purple and orange, Emma sat in her armchair, Whiskers nestled in her lap. The glow of the fireplace bathed the room in warmth, but Emma felt a chill that reached into her bones. The memory of that day haunted her, gnawing at her peace of mind. Whiskers, sensing her unease, lifted her head and nuzzled Emma's hand, her purrs a soothing balm for Emma's frayed nerves. "Why did you do it?" Emma whispered, tears stinging her eyes. Whiskers blinked up at her, eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. Emma knew it was silly to expect an answer, but she couldn't help the question. It was as if Whiskers had understood the danger and acted to save her. The thought both comforted and unsettled Emma. That night, unable to sleep, Emma wandered to the window. She peered across the street and saw a sliver of light escaping through the crack in Paul's curtains. A shadow moved behind them, restless and tense. Her curiosity, coupled with a sense of foreboding, grew. She knew very little about her new neighbor, and the accident had left an imprint that couldn't be ignored. The following morning, Emma woke to the sound of raised voices. She hurried to her front door and opened it just in time to see Paul speaking angrily to a man in a dark suit who stood on the steps of his house. The man's posture was rigid, and his expression stern. Their argument was muffled, but Emma caught fragments, words like deadline, risk, and consequences. Whiskers, who had followed Emma to the door, watched intently, her tail flicking with a nervous energy. The tension in the air was palpable, and Emma felt an unease she hadn't experienced since the day of the near accident. The encounter ended abruptly, with Paul slamming his door and the man in the suit walking briskly to his car. As the stranger drove away, Emma's mind raced. Who was Paul, really? And what had driven him to distraction that day on the road? Emma's concern deepened over the next few days. The neighborhood felt different, as if a storm cloud loomed just out of sight. Paul's car remained parked, unmoving, and his blinds stayed drawn tight. Emma tried to push the worries aside, but each time she looked at Whiskers, she felt the cat's keen gaze on her, as if Whiskers, too, sensed the shift in their world. Then, one evening, a loud crash jolted Emma from her sleep. Whiskers, who had been curled up at the foot of the bed, leapt up, fur on end. Emma's heart raced as she threw on her robe and hurried to the window. What she saw made her blood run cold, smoke curling from Paul's house and flames beginning to lick the edges of the curtains. "Fire!" Emma shouted, panic surging through her. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone to call for help, but Whiskers dashed toward the front door, meowing frantically. "Whiskers, no!" Emma cried, but the cat was already out the door, a blur of fur and determination heading straight for the burning house. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as she watched Whiskers disappear into the night, her small frame darting toward the heart of the chaos. The air was thick with smoke, and the orange glow of the flames painted the street in eerie light. Paul's house stood like a crumbling silhouette, each second seeming to push it further toward collapse. Emma's instincts screamed at her to chase after Whiskers, but fear rooted her in place. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her phone, calling 911 and stammering out her address. As the operator assured her that help was on the way, Emma dropped the phone and stepped onto the porch, eyes fixed on the blazing inferno. "Whiskers!" Her voice cracked as she called out, desperation turning her shout into a sob. In that moment, the years she'd spent with the cat flooded her memory. Every morning sunbeam they'd shared, every gentle purr that comforted her through lonely nights. The idea of losing Whiskers was unbearable, a sharp pain that clenched her chest. The front door of Paul's house burst open, and Paul himself staggered out, coughing and clutching a cloth over his mouth. His eyes were wide with panic and confusion as he stumbled into the street, gasping for fresh air. Emma ran to him, her fear momentarily overridden by concern. "Paul, are you okay?" she shouted, gripping his arm as he bent over, wheezing. "Something, gas leak," he managed between coughs, pointing weakly back at the house. "I couldn't find my—" His eyes widened as a high-pitched yowl came from inside the house, cutting through the roar of the flames. Emma's heart dropped. Whiskers was still inside. Without thinking, Emma released Paul and surged forward, but he grabbed her wrist, pulling her back. "No. You can't go in there," he shouted, his voice hoarse but firm. Tears blurred Emma's vision as she fought against his hold, but Paul's grip didn't falter. Then, as if in answer to their silent prayers, a small figure emerged at the edge of the flames. Whiskers darted through the thick smoke, her fur singed and eyes wide with terror. In her mouth, she clutched a thin object, a notebook, its leather cover scorched but intact. Paul's eyes widened in disbelief as Whiskers stumbled toward them, the notebook dragging along the ground. Emma fell to her knees as Whiskers collapsed into her arms, panting heavily. The sound of sirens pierced the night, signaling the arrival of the fire trucks. Emma cradled Whiskers, her hands shaking as she whispered words of comfort, tears streaming down her face. Paul knelt beside them, reaching for the notebook with trembling fingers. His face was a portrait of awe and gratitude, shadowed by the flickering flames. He met Emma's gaze, his eyes red from smoke and unshed tears. "I don't know how, but she saved my life," he said, voice choked. Emma glanced at the singed notebook, noticing its weight in the story that had just unfolded. Whiskers, who had barely stirred, let out a soft meow as if to say, "It's done." The fire crew rushed to douse the flames, their shouts and the rush of water filling the air as Emma held Whiskers tighter, unwilling to let go. Paul's hand hovered over the notebook, now resting between them. This has everything," he whispered. His eyes met Emma's, full of emotions she couldn't decipher, relief, regret, and a newfound respect. He turned back to the cat, a deep breath shuddering from his chest. "You didn't just save me," he said, voice breaking. "You saved everything I've worked for." Emma looked at Whiskers, her heart swelling with pride and a love so fierce it hurt. The realization that her beloved companion had risked her life not once, but twice, brought a wave of emotion that made Emma's tears fall faster. Whiskers, despite her exhaustion, gave a weak but triumphant purr, pressing her head against Emma's hand. Paul sat back on his heels as the firefighters pushed past them, the inferno now under control but still blazing with residual heat. He clutched the notebook to his chest, a tear escaping down his soot-streaked face. For the first time, he looked at Emma not as a stranger, but as someone who had shared in a miracle. "I owe her everything," he whispered, barely audible over the chaos. The scene shifted around them as firefighters shouted instructions and water hissed against the flames, but Emma and Paul remained kneeling in the street, anchored by the small hero cradled in Emma's arms. The fire was finally extinguished, leaving behind the charred remnants of Paul's house. The acrid smell of smoke still clung to the air as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon. Emma sat on the curb, her arms wrapped protectively around Whiskers, who had started to stir, her eyes half open and dazed. Paul sat beside them, the scorched notebook cradled in his lap, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and awe. Paramedics approached, checking on everyone and offering blankets and oxygen. Emma waved them off gently, focused on the cat in her arms. Whiskers meowed softly, pressing her small warm body against Emma's chest. The relief that flooded Emma was overwhelming. Whiskers was alive, and that was all that mattered. She whispered soothing words into Whiskers' ear, her tears soaking into the cat's singed fur. Paul glanced at Emma, his eyes bloodshot and full of gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy. "I don't think I would have survived without her." Emma's gaze shifted to the notebook, which Paul held as if it were a lifeline. "What is that?" she asked softly, curiosity finally breaking through the cloud of relief. Paul took a deep breath, the lines of tension on his face softening. "It's everything," he began, voice cracking. "My research, my work. I've been developing a safety technology that could save countless lives. But it's also what put me in danger. That man who came to my house, the one you saw, was a corporate agent sent to pressure me. I was trying to finish it under impossible deadlines. The stress. It's why I wasn't paying attention that day when I almost hit you." Emma's eyes widened as the weight of his words sank in. Whiskers had not only saved Emma from the near accident, but had also risked her life to retrieve the notebook that held the culmination of Paul's work. The realization made Emma's chest swell with pride and a deep sense of awe. Whiskers, her faithful companion, was not just a pet but a guardian, a hero in fur and whiskers. The paramedics finally persuaded Emma to let them check Whiskers. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, examined the cat and smiled reassuringly. "She's a fighter," the medic said. "Some singed fur, but she'll be okay. Just keep her hydrated and let her rest." Emma nodded, her eyes misting over again as she thanked the medic. The crowd of neighbors who had gathered in the street began to disperse, murmuring in low voices. Some gave Emma and Paul lingering looks of astonishment and admiration. The story of Whiskers' bravery would surely be retold many times over, spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. Paul sat quietly, the gravity of what had just happened settling over him. He turned to Emma, his expression softening further. "I don't know how to express this, but your cat, she saved more than just me. With this research safe, I can make sure my work reaches the right people, without the interference of those who only care about profit." He paused, emotion making his voice falter. "And I owe that to Whiskers." Emma felt a lump in her throat and could only nod, her hand resting on Whiskers' small body as the cat finally drifted into a peaceful sleep. The first golden rays of morning light bathed the street, casting a soft glow that seemed to hold a promise of new beginnings. The days that followed were marked by unexpected camaraderie. Paul's story spread, not just in the neighborhood but beyond, as local news picked up the tale of the heroic cat that saved a man and his groundbreaking work. Reporters visited Emma's home, where Whiskers sat regally on the windowsill, her fur now trimmed and tended after the ordeal, looking as composed as ever. Paul became a familiar face at Emma's house, no longer the mysterious stranger across the street. He shared coffee on her porch, their conversations drifting from past hardships to newfound hopes. The shared trauma of that night forged an unlikely bond between them, one built on gratitude, trust, and the shared admiration for Whiskers' courage. One afternoon, Paul knocked on Emma's door with a smile that reached his eyes. In his hands, he held a small, gold-engraved plaque. "For you," he said, handing it over. Emma's eyes widened as she read the inscription. "In honor of Whiskers, the brave soul whose heroism changed lives." Emma's heart swelled as she turned the plaque over in her hands, tears welling up once again. Whiskers, who sat by the window, seemed to understand. She leapt gracefully down and walked over to rub against Paul's leg, purring loudly. Paul chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind Whiskers' ears. "I've arranged for a grant in Whiskers' name," he said, his voice softening. "Part of the funding for my work will go toward animal shelters and pet rescue programs. It's the least I can do to honor what she's done." Emma was speechless, her hand covering her mouth as emotion choked her voice. "Thank you, Paul," she managed, her eyes meeting his with a shared understanding that went beyond words. The days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood returned to its quiet routine. But Emma's life had changed. Whiskers, her silent, brave companion, became a symbol of resilience, not just in their home but in the hearts of everyone who heard their story. The little cat with the emerald green eyes had proven that courage could come in the smallest packages, and that love, when shared, had the power to change lives in the most unexpected ways. Life gradually resumed a familiar rhythm, but the story of Whiskers' bravery remained etched in the fabric of the community. The tale was shared over backyard fences, in bustling coffee shops, and at town meetings, each retelling adding a touch more awe to the already miraculous events. Emma found herself at the center of attention, a place she'd never sought but now embraced with quiet gratitude. Whiskers became something of a local legend. Children would pass by Emma's house, peering through the garden gate in hopes of catching a glimpse of the heroic cat. Whiskers, with her fur now fully regrown and gleaming, would often sit perched on the windowsill, watching the world with those sharp, knowing green eyes. Sometimes, she would reward the onlookers with a regal nod or a flick of her tail, as if acknowledging her newfound fame. The grant Paul had established in Whiskers' name made tangible changes in the lives of animals throughout the town. The local shelter expanded, adopting a no-kill policy and doubling its capacity. Stray pets found homes, and volunteers grew in number, inspired by Whiskers' story. Emma received countless letters from people who had adopted animals, each one describing how their new furry friends had brought joy and companionship into their lives. Emma's heart felt fuller than it had in years. The grief that had once weighed her down after Tom's passing had been replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose and connection. She often thought back to that fateful night when Whiskers darted into danger not once but twice, propelled by an unfathomable bond and an instinct that defied reason. The realization that love could inspire such bravery left Emma humbled and grateful. One sunny afternoon, Emma sat on her porch, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of jasmine through the air. Whiskers rested beside her, eyes half closed as she basked in the warmth. Paul joined them, carrying 2 cups of iced tea. He settled into the chair next to Emma, a comfortable silence falling between them. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Paul said after a while, glancing at Whiskers. "How something so small can make such a big impact." Emma smiled, her eyes softening as she stroked Whiskers' back. "Yes," she said. "She reminded me that even when life feels quiet and predictable, miracles can still happen." Paul nodded, looking out at the street where children played and neighbors exchanged greetings. The scene was ordinary, yet charged with a sense of togetherness that hadn't been there before. Whiskers' act had become a thread that wove their lives together, a story of hope and courage that transcended the ordinary. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden light across the yard, Emma felt a deep sense of contentment. The empty spaces in her heart were now filled with memories that glistened like jewels: Tom's laughter, the warm comfort of Whiskers' purr, and now, the knowledge that their story had touched countless lives. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Paul's voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if he were voicing a fragile thought. Emma's gaze met his, a small, understanding smile curving her lips. "I used to," she admitted. "But now, I focus on what is. And what is, Paul, is pretty wonderful." Whiskers opened her eyes and looked up at Emma, as if to echo her sentiment. She let out a single, soft purr and nestled closer. Emma knew that the bond they shared was rare, born from shared moments of comfort and, now, of heroism. Whiskers was more than a pet. She was a testament to the power of love and instinct, a reminder that even the smallest among us can be heroes. Emma leaned back in her chair, the breeze rustling the leaves as the last light of day caressed her face. Beside her, Paul took a sip of his tea, content to share the quiet moment. And at her feet, Whiskers, the fearless guardian with emerald eyes, closed her eyes and purred, the sound a lullaby of peace and triumph that resonated not just in Emma's heart, but in the hearts of everyone who heard her story. It's an honor to be able to create content for you. If you want to support the channel even more, you can follow the instructions that I will leave on the pinned comment. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Love you all.